Hi there, welcome to AP Environmental Science, Chapter 16, Lecture Video Part 2. This section begins, we're going to talk about coral. All right, coral are an animal, actually, and they create these reef structures that are very important. Why are they important? They create locations where lots of habitat is created for organisms, and that habitat brings a lot of life there. So coral reefs are very diverse, very productive parts of our planet as long as they're alive still. All right. So what is coral? They're little animals. They're little tiny marine animals. These show what corals look like. And they have an exterior shell made out of calcium carbonate, which makes them hardened. Okay, their surface. They have a relationship. They have this type of algae called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae reside inside of the coral. So they live within these little tentacles of the coral. You can see a picture here. Zooxanthellae live within those tentacles. What does a zooxanthellae do? Well, they're algae, and they're photosynthetic algae, and they are different colors, which is why coral that is alive shows all these different colors, these little pinks and oranges and even blues and purples. Those colors are due to the algae that is living inside of the coral. Okay. Without that algae there, coral does not look like that. It looks white. So whenever you see coral on the surface of the earth and you see coral on land, people collect coral from different locations of the world. When you collect coral, it is always white. And that's because it has been bleached or has gone through coral bleaching. And that's because the zooxanthellae will leave the coral, or they will die, or they will be spit out by the coral because they are no longer doing their job. What is their job? To make most of the food that the coral lives off of. Coral have stinging tentacles, all right? They're kind of, they're in the jellyfish and sea anemone family, and these stinging tentacles allow them, they can sting and capture prey that swims along, but that is a very small proportion of where they get their nutrition. Most of their nutrition comes from the photosynthesis that's being done by the zooxanthellae. So they have what's called a mutualistic, both parties are happy relationship. The coral gets food from the zooxanthellae, so zooxanthellae gets a place to live. It gets protected by the coral. So they both benefit from this relationship. All right. So what's happening? Coral reefs, they're structures made out of calcium carbonate. All right, skeletons of the coral for the most part. What do? Well, they're generally located in some cases right on coastlines of islands, and they protect shorelines. All right, so from these waves, and wave damage will do erosion. So they protect shorelines. That's a common way. They protect shorelines so well, they're generally great places to go surfing because they absorb the energy of the waves. So Hawaii is very well known for its surfing. And the reason the surfing is so good, these giant, massive waves come in, and then the reef, the waves crash on the reef rather than crashing on the shoreline and eroding the shoreline. Okay. What are they made of? Oh, millions of these little corals are packed together, and they live in a colonial fashion. So they live in colonies, right? Very, very biodiverse. Lots of habitat. And when coral's alive, you're talking algae. There's a lot of productivity. All these colors are caused by the algae that's inside, those zooxanthellae that's living within the coral. What is happening in the coral? Well, one of the things that's destroying coral is the ocean is getting more acidic. All right. What is making the ocean more acidic? Carbon dioxide. Where does the carbon dioxide come? Humans. We burn things. We combust things. We burn fossil fuels. As we burn things, we make carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide absorbs into the water. All right. That absorbing carbon dioxide in the water creates problems. It makes the water more acidic, and I'll explain to you in a second what that does specifically to the coral. So coral needs carbonate ions, which are naturally floating around in the water. When the ocean gets more acidic, those carbonate ions attach to hydrogen ions in the acidic, and they make bicarbonate ions, which isn't the same thing as carbonate. Carbonate and bicarbonate are slightly different. Coral needs carbonate in the water, not bicarbonate. It needs carbonate in the water. And so acidification of the ocean removes carbonate, which makes it harder for coral to produce their actual shell. All right. When they lose color, that means they are dead. Most of the coral, like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, most of the coral there is dead. The coral is not alive. It's white. You have to go farther and farther out in farther regions to find coral that actually has all those beautiful colors. What is doing this to the coral? Well, climate change is involved because climate change has to do with the production of carbon dioxide, which is leading to acidification. Pollution is a big one. Eutrophication is a big one. We do a lot of farming on our planet, and all those nutrients, nitrates, and phosphates, or nitrogen and phosphorus, makes its way in the body of the water. Eutrophication takes place, and then that creates a hypoxic area, no oxygen, and that lack of oxygen kills the coral. The coral need oxygen. Okay. Other causes, natural causes, just natural fluctuations in coral dying and surviving. This is things naturally die on the planet, so things dying is not always man caused. Okay, but the biggest causes: eutrophication for nutrient over enrichment, pollution, and climate change. And climate change is related to CO2, which is related to acidification. Okay, open ocean ecosystems, they vary. Why? Because it's the open ocean. But what is the base of the food chain in these ecosystems? The base of the food chain in these ecosystems is plankton. Which kind of plankton? Phytoplankton. Phytoplankton get eaten by another kind of plankton called zooplankton. Okay, so there's different kinds of plankton. Zooplankton are the ones that look like animals. Phytoplankton are the ones that look more like plants. All right. What else happens? Well, at the bottom of the ocean, there is the base of the food chain at the bottom of the ocean. There is sugar being produced down there, but it's not photosynthesis, it's chemosynthesis. This is from an earlier chapter. They're using the chemicals, the hydrogen sulfides that get poured out of those hydrothermal vents, and the hydrogen sulfide that's getting poured out of them is getting turned into sugar in a lot of cases. All right. Marine pollution, well, the Clean Water Act, basically, until the passage of the Clean Water Act, most of the pollution in the ocean was point source, which means it was from a direct source. All right. Now, most of the pollution that's affecting the ocean today is non-point sources, meaning a whole bunch of countless small sources are putting things into our watershed, and then they're turning into basically they're making their way into the nearest body of water. Right? And then that nearest body of water is flowing to a tributary into a river, and it's making its way into the ocean. So most of the debris, most of the pollution in the ocean now is not from point source. It is now from non-point source. So it's a bunch of small occurrences that are leading to a lot of pollution in the ocean. What I mean by small occurrences, you have a whole bunch of small boats all releasing oil into the water. Okay, it's not one boat, it's not a point source, it's many different small sources. We have a lot of cars on our planet. A lot of them leak oil and leak other oil-based products, which become part of runoff and make their way in the ocean that way. So today, most of the pollution in the ocean is not one major catastrophe. It's caused from a bunch of small ones, non-point sources. Plastic debris. Whoa, now this is a problem. Thing about plastic is we designed it in a way so that it broke down slowly, which is what we wanted plastic to do. Now, the problem is we have so much plastic on our planet, and we use it to make everything, especially water bottles. Bottles of water are the biggest problem here, I would say. That plastic breaks down, and when plastic breaks down, it just becomes smaller pieces of plastic, and then it becomes smaller pieces of plastic, and then it becomes microscopic, still plastic pieces, and eventually it takes a couple 100 to 200 years for this plastic to completely break down. The problem is these microscopic plastic beads are making their way into the fish and the organisms that filter feed, that just filter. They filter organisms through their tissue, and they're picking things up from the water. So this plastic is in almost all the living organisms on the planet. It's so bad we have areas called gyres, and these are areas where currents converge. And you may know, like if you ever have a jacuzzi and you see like a bunch of like foamy material in it, and it'll all converge into one like central area. That's kind of like a gyre in your jacuzzi. Well, we have them in the ocean, and these are areas where this plastic debris piles up. It's so bad that you're talking piles. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, they're the size of Texas. They're not small. They're huge. These garbage patches of plastic are as big as an entire state. Okay, this is just showing you the Pacific. I believe there's garbage patches in the Atlantic also, but there's two really, really large ones in the Pacific Ocean, in the North Pacific, that is. Okay. Now, there are problems with large oil spills, but they're not as common as they used to be. The two big ones that you need to totally know about is the Exxon Valdez. This is when I was a kid, back in 1989. An oil tanker ran aground up in Alaska, and it created a mess. It leaked millions of gallons of oil into the harbor, into the bay, and it created mass problems, mass pollution problems. Okay, that happened in 1989. The Exxon Valdez, owned by the oil company called Exxon. Okay, the Deepwater Horizon was owned by BP, or British Petroleum. This was an oil rig off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Louisiana, I believe. What happened there? There was an explosion. It blew up. Something malfunctioned. People died. It blew up. When it blew up, it ruptured a hole in one of the pipes that was bringing crude oil to the surface. It leaked for months until they figured out how to somehow secure it. It took them that long to figure out how to secure it. The problems with these large oil spills and these ships and all this stuff is the potential for major catastrophe. I mean, it affected that area of, it's still affecting that part of the country. For many, many years, I was telling my students in class, don't eat shrimp, because a lot of the shrimp that we eat in the United States comes from that Gulf Coast region. And after all that oil ended up in the water, there's undoubtedly carcinogens and nasty chemicals and pollutants that are leaked from crude oil into the water. Crude oil is nasty. It is not the oil that you see or gasoline like in your car. Not like that at all. It is nasty. It is carcinogenic. It is full of lots of chemicals that are not healthy at all. So the water was very polluted. So Deepwater Horizon was the BP, the British Petroleum owned that Deepwater Horizon. This is owned by the Exxon oil company, or the energy company in the Valdez. Oh, and by the way, last minute, about half the oil that makes petroleum, that makes its way in the ocean, are natural seeps. So there's natural cracks in the earth. Oil is naturally being discharged in the ocean, but these aren't as bad. Why? Because they're happening at smaller rates, and they're not affecting large areas at one point like these major catastrophes did. Okay, seafood. Well, if you eat seafood, one of the common contaminants you talk about seafood is mercury. Well, mercury is in higher consumers. So higher up the food chain you go, the more mercury that you're going to find in the tissue of the organism. All right. So mercury generally occurs as you go up the food chain. All right. Lower on the food chain, no, you're not going to find mercury in it. If you're eating shark, if you're eating swordfish, halibut, tuna, things higher up the food chain, yeah, higher occurrence of mercury for sure. And it gets magnified as you go up the food chain. So there's a lot of mercury in these items compared to how much you should be ingesting. It is said you're not supposed to be eating these types of fish very often at all because of how much mercury they have in their tissue as a result of the accumulation of mercury that's naturally in the water. Where does the mercury that is in the water come from? It's believed that it comes from combustion of fossil fuels and mining. So it's made its way into the water as a result of it's released when we burn things. Okay. And it's also made its way in there as runoff from mining practices. Low on the food chain, no, you're not going to see much mercury. There isn't enough mercury in the water to affect you and me. We can drink water, ocean water all day, and we're not going to get mercury poisoning. But it accumulates and magnifies up the chain, which creates problems for organisms up the food chain, or us when we eat those organisms. Algal blooms, just like we spoke of in an earlier chapter, nutrients, nitrates and phosphates, or nitrogen and phosphorus, cause algae to bloom. Certain algae produce toxins that are harmful, that can kill you, basically. We don't have them in San Diego. We get red tides here sometimes where it looks mercury and reddish brown in color. Some of them are harmful. Not all red tides, or not all of them are, not all harmful algal blooms are red tides either. So harmful they can be. There could be algae that produce toxins, and that's when they become dangerous for the fish and all the organisms in the water. Okay, red tide is just when it becomes reddish and mercury. So this is also an algal bloom here. Okay. Ocean chemistry. Let's talk about ocean chemistry. So we already briefly spoke about acidification, and we talked about the calcium and the carbonate and all those things that are needed by organisms for their shells. So what happens? The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide. All right, and where does this carbon dioxide come from? Well, we burn things. Fossil fuels are being burnt all the time, and this carbon dioxide gets absorbed. So a lot of people who are anti-climate change believers will tell you, well, it's not. They'll say the climate is not changing because so much of it is being absorbed by the ocean. All right. Well, if that is the case, and if they were correct and that was the case, that means they're okay with the oceans getting destroyed because that is what's happening as a result of that. Carbon dioxide, when it gets absorbed and it dissolves in ocean water, some of it becomes carbonic acid. That's like carbonation in our sodas, basically. All right. That carbonic acid that it turns into dissociates or breaks apart into its ions. The ions of the carbonic acid are bicarbonate ion, HCO3, and hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions make things more acidic, more H+, more acidity, lowering the pH. The pH never goes below 7, but it does drop below the average of an 8.1, which creates problems. All right. About 30 to 40% of human-generated carbon dioxide is absorbed in the ocean. That's a lot. We're making a lot. We make a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay. Eventually, they believe that the ocean is going to be saturated and it won't be able to absorb anymore, which is going to increase the rate of global warming, is what scientists believe. What happens? Well, as carbon dioxide is absorbed, we just said bicarbonate and H+ ions are created because of carbonic acid. pH decreases. Okay. That's what happens there. Why is it a problem? Well, because now you have all these H+, they naturally combine with carbonate ions that are floating around in the water naturally. So let's go back. So carbonic acid becomes bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions can react with carbonate, forming bicarbonate, okay, ions. So they remove carbonate from the water. Carbonate is needed to combine with calcium in order to make the shells of sea creatures. So as the pH is dropped, there's less carbonate in the water because of what's happening, because of all the carbon dioxide that's being absorbed. Less carbonate in the water means shelled sea creatures are not able to form shell as fast as the shell is dissolving. So those lower pHs will dissolve their shells, basically. So that is a major problem for shelled creatures. We're talking about coral reefs being important. Well, they're getting destroyed this is one of the things that's destroying coral reefs. Yeah. Emptying of the oceans. Well, I already spoke to you in the very beginning of this lecture, part one's lecture. I talked to you about the central case had to do with overfishing and overharvesting. Well, because of technology, we are overfishing. We are taking a lot of fish out of the ocean at a rapid rate. It is the tragedy of the commons, which is what's happening to the oceans. Over time, though, our fishing catch has stayed about stable for many years now, but that's not a good thing. Stability means that we haven't caught more or less. We're catching about the same, but the fish we're catching are smaller and younger, all right, which means we're emptying the ocean, and we're using more technology, and we're going deeper we're going in farther away and deeper to catch these fish. All right. We're also fishing down the food chain because we are overfishing the higher things on the food chain. Okay. So we are basically emptying the oceans. Humans are creating a tragedy with the oceans. Methods of fishing, factory fishing, okay, or industrialized fishing. These are just ways of catching a lot of fish at once. There's a lot of bycatch, which is the fish you catch that is unintended. Purse seining uses a net, basically. Drift netting uses another net also. Long line fishing here. They set out these lines and then a bunch of bait, and then things come along and eat them. Bottom trawling, or trawling in general, where you're dragging something along or dredging it. Bottom trawling specifically is very, very bad. Not only does this catch a lot of things that are unintended, it destroys the ecology and the ecosystems on the bottom. Those important bottom benthic ecosystems get destroyed, and they create massive shifts in the food chain. So bottom trawling is awful. It's the equivalent of clear cutting a forest down to nothing, basically. All right. Bycatch, I said, unintended catch. This is a problem. A lot of these nets, a lot of these long lines, you're catching things that are not intended. Every now and then you'll see tuna that'll say dolphin safe tuna. That means they're using a method that is preserving dolphins and not catching a lot of dolphins as bycatch. All right. And it's just showing you that dolphin populations have basically, they still haven't totally improved. They haven't completely recovered. Back in the 70s, we weren't protecting them. A lot of netting, a lot of drift netting, a lot of purse seining was being used. So a lot of dolphins were being caught by accident. So their populations dropped drastically, and they still haven't really recovered. They stayed low now, basically. All right. Bottom trawling, I already mentioned to you. I just said to you, it destroys the ecology. So this would be the bottom before trawling and after trawling. It's gone. The habitat is destroyed. The crevices and the cracks and all the little rocks and little structures where organisms would live, it's gone. It's been completely destroyed. So this is the results of trawling, bottom trawling specifically. All right. I already mentioned to you what is covering up the collapse of the large fisheries. Well, we're just getting better at fishing, and we're going out to other places, and we're getting better at finding it. So we're using technology to help finding it. It makes it seem like we haven't destroyed the oceans, but we actually already have. We have, like I said, fish stocks are lower than they've ever been. The size of fish we're catching are smaller. The age of the fish is younger, which is bad because when you're catching younger fish, you're not giving them enough time to reproduce. One of the reasons why there's a catch, a size requirement in what you're catching, the reason there's a size requirement is so that you're catching fish that have been able to get to reproductive age so they can continue the population. So a lot of times when they say your fish is too small and you need to throw it back, you need to throw it back because you need to give the fish an opportunity to reproduce and produce more offspring so that fishing can continue and become sustainable that way. All right. I mentioned to you earlier, we're now fishing smaller fish down the food chain, and that's because we've overfished the fish higher on the food chain. Marine protected areas, these are areas where you can't even do oil drilling, for example, because the potential for damage to the area is they want to put that off limits. Marine reserves are areas where they don't even allow fishing at all. That's probably because the area has been overfished or destroyed. So they're trying to maybe recover a fishery in some cases. All right, I'll stop there.